Our purpose here today is to model what civil conversation looks like among Christians of differing beliefs. There are some other kinds of topics that we could have chosen to model civil conversation. We could have chosen to talk about the weaknesses of the college bowl system. We could have chosen some, benign little religious topics that I could think of, but will not list at the moment. But the whole point is civil conversation happens not very often anymore. Way too many people just screaming at each other from whatever viewpoint they may hold. And so our task was simply to create an environment and model that. Now, Dr. Vik Mccracken, my colleague on my immediate right, teaches in the College of Biblical Studies. He is a highly respected theologian and ethicist. He became my friend on Facebook, really, when I would occasionally weigh in on extended discussions of philosophy and ethics, hoping that no one in his rather rarefied collection of friends would find me out before I could disappear into the ether. Dr. Cole Bennett became my friend when we sat together in Arts and Sciences department chairs meetings for decades. Seemed like it was actually only a few years, but it definitely felt longer than that. And so our friendship was bonded by arguments over the Oxford comma and frustrations over administrivia and other things like that. He is a professor of English and directs the Writing Center. I'm not sure whether it's dearer to his heart to be introduced as an accomplished rhetorician or as a devoted swing dancer and sponsor of the ACU Swing Cats. I have my suspicions. Either way, he's a great thinker and a great writer. I'm Cheryl Bacon. I'm chair of the Journalism and Mass Communications Department. I teach public relations and writing classes. And my job here today is to be the moderator. And for those of you who know these two gentlemen, you know that I am pretty much superfluous to the entire thing. But in the interest of full disclosure, since they will be talking about their own political philosophies and engaging one another, I can best be described as a raging moderate, which means I could never get elected to anything. So, to begin, Cole and Vik each have a short statement that explains very briefly, their personal political philosophies. And after that, I may toss some questions their way. I'm sure that they could take it from there for hours or weeks. But I promise to interrupt periodically to move them on to new subjects. My only advantage here is that we agreed on a format, but they don't know what I'm going to ask. So, with that, Vik.
Do y'all want me to stand or sit? Stand? Okay. Now, Cole and I both have some written remarks, and so I'm going to go ahead and read them because he already knows what I'm going to say, and I don't want to get off track too much. You don't know what I'm going to say, but at the conclusion you will. I'm going to begin with a thought experiment. I do that a lot in my classes. Imagine for the moment that you are stranded in the middle of an ocean, shipwrecked, and about to drown. Struggling to keep your head above water, you observe an approaching pirate ship. As the ship comes close, you cry out, begging to be rescued. The pirate captain looks at you there, drowning in the water, and without a hint of malice says to you, "I'll be happy to bring you onto my ship, but in return, you will be required to remain my ship's cabin boy for the rest of your life. The choice is yours, take it or leave it." It is a pleasure to join Cole today in this campus conversation. In a way, this event is the extension of a conversation that Cole and I have been having over the last decade. You'll find evidence of this conversation on our respective Facebook pages and our email inboxes. Cole and I disagree about some questions that at their heart are both political and moral. We'll talk about these differences today. But before getting to them, I want to make clear to all of you that there are a number of things about which Cole and I agree. We are both Christians who want to follow Jesus. We are also very good friends who over the last decade have worked hard at maintaining our friendship in spite of our differences. This work is a delight. Cole is an amazing colleague, and he is a good person. We both believe that Christian faith should inform how Christians think about political questions. Neither one of us believes that Christian faith is something to be compartmentalized. We both want our students to learn how to pursue moral and political discussions with people with whom they disagree. Cole is a libertarian. I am a political liberal. And while these labels today might suggest that we are political opponents, at the heart of both political perspectives is the belief that liberty is a fundamental political value that a just society must protect. But yes, Cole and I disagree. Our differences stem from our different answers to a single question: what does a commitment to liberty entail? Cole believes that policies and programs that liberals like me support infringe on the liberty of individuals. When the state taxes some people to fund a social safety net for other people, the state is violating the liberty of those who pay taxes. It is effectively stealing from them. I disagree. Indeed, in my view, the social safety net is necessary precisely because programs and institutions like Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, public education, the Stafford Loan Program, Pell Grants, and the like protect the equal worth of liberty. Cole believes that the liberal programs that I support threaten liberty. By contrast, I believe that Cole does not value liberty enough because too often libertarians are indifferent to the conditions essential to ensure that people have reasonable choices to make for their lives. Now, when I say that Cole does not value liberty enough, these might come across as fighting words when addressed to a libertarian. So let me explain the point. Imagine yourself once again stranded in the open sea with the pirate captain awaiting your reply. Consider this. When you agree to become the pirate captain's cabin boy forever, was this a free action on your part? The captain is not coercing you to become his cabin boy. He is simply making you an offer. Take it or leave it. The pirate is not pointing a gun at you, forcing you to become his slave. From the libertarian perspective, it's hard to conclude that he's doing anything improper. He is simply taking stock of your circumstances and making an offer based on the market conditions, so to speak. But here's the point. If you are in such a desperate circumstance that your only options are either, number one, to drown, or number two, to enslave yourself to a pirate captain, can we really say that your decision to enslave yourself was a free one? In my view, the liberal view, as it were, the desperate circumstances of your life in that moment, the threat of imminent peril, made this decision less than free. To protect your liberty in this circumstance, I first need to attend to the conditions that rob you of reasonable possibilities. I don't have a, yeah, there we go. I'll just go from here. That rob you of reasonable possibilities. I need to ensure that you have options that will make it possible for you to do something other than choose between imminent death and slavery. Now, admittedly, most of us will never find ourselves staring into the eyes of a pirate captain. But sadly, in our world, such as it is, there are far too many instances in which poverty, racism, sexism, and discrimination constrain the opportunities that people have to make meaningful choices about their futures. This is what political liberals like me want to protect. A child born into poverty in a community that is indifferent to whether or not that child has access to a good education is less than free. This is why we are okay with tax-subsidized public education. A college student afflicted with a chronic health condition is less than free when she is required to forego her college education because a full-time retail job is her only means to get the health care she needs. This is why liberals like me support a universal system of health coverage, which presumes access to basic health care as a right, not a mere privilege. We value universal police and fire protection. We'll go to the ramparts to defend the access that many of our students at ACU have to state-subsidized student loans that make higher education more affordable. We believe that a just society will protect the vulnerable from pirate captains, so to speak. We do all of these things because we value liberty. We see these programs as tools that enhance opportunity, protecting the equal worth of liberty for all. Cole, I look forward to our conversation.
Let's hear it for Vik for an opening statement. I have also a brief opening statement, but before I do, thank you very much for coming to this session, and I will echo Dr. Bacon when she says there's so much uncivil conversation happening in the political realm that it is a great treat to be able to have a conversation like this. As Vik said, it's been going on for about 10 years, and I've tried to remember how I first met Vik, and only thing I can remember are my students saying, "You need to meet Vik McCracken," if you feel that way. Okay. So, and it being introduced as the faculty sponsor for the Swing Cats always makes me want to say, who wants to learn to Charleston before we leave? Okay. I forgot these, sorry. I need these, okay. The purpose of this session is to illustrate, as Cheryl said, how Christians can demonstrate civility while discussing different political ideals, particularly regarding the role that government should have in our lives. My knowing Vik McCracken over our years at ACU has been a blessing. His rich background in ethics and theology has caused me to reach more deeply into my own heart and mind to discover and better articulate my own political positions. Beyond that, however, our friendship and collegial discussions have forced me to understand that people who hold different viewpoints from me usually have complex, nuanced warrants for doing so, despite reductive caricatures offered by the world. So as I offer my own brief articulation of a civil ideal, I do so with thanks to Vik, not for being a mere gadfly to spur me towards more pointed barbs, but for challenging me as a fellow believer in Christ to examine, verify, and occasionally change and challenge my syllogisms. I'm encouraged that Christians of all political stripes are moved to help the needy. That is very encouraging to me as I listen to my Christian friends, that they argue for a government through which they believe people's most important needs can be met. I think it's very important to acknowledge that fact. When some say, and I've heard people say, well, libertarians are just greedy individualists who want to step on people to succeed. Such criticisms fall flat, not only to my ears, but to Vik's as well. And when others say, well, progressives just use politics to continue to promote class division for political power, my eyes roll as fast as Vik's. That's because we understand too well the motivations that drive our search for a political ideal are neither about mere power nor mere money. So here are some points to get us started. If labels matter, as my two colleagues have said, I would call myself a classical liberal, or libertarian is the most current word. As we go about the business of setting up a state, I would argue that a person's liberty should be priority. As you can see, Vik and I have different definitions of liberty in that sense. The freedoms, I would argue a person's liberty should be priority. The freedoms to sell his or her labor, to own and manage private property, and to enter into private contracts should remain unmolested. Such a system serves both rich and poor, both sick and healthy, both Christians and non-Christians. Over time, libertarians believe that such arrangement builds wealth in a nation more robustly than any other system and benefits its citizens as a result. I'm referencing Adam Smith there. Beyond that, however, a free society allows Christians to be Christians, to worship, to evangelize, and to marshal resources to help those who are in need. Vik and I are both quite concerned about people around us who don't have what they need: food, medicine, protection from the elements, etc. But I would argue such circumstances call for, and indeed are limited to, Christians voluntarily giving and persuading others to give. Vik and other people in his camp would argue that promoting state coercion counts as an acceptable expression of Christian faith. This is where our views diverge most obviously. So if I may quickly address the pirate ship situation, since Vik brought it up. If a person is drowning in the ocean and a pirate ship comes by and says, I will save you if you'll be my cabin boy forever, that is a very difficult situation. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And I think Vik and I both want the best for that person who's drowning. And I think the person has a choice to drown or to be a cabin boy. If the person if it were me, I think I would rather be a cabin boy than to die. That's still not very good. But in the strict sense of the meaning, it's an economic decision. I win because I'm not dead, and the pirate wins because he gets a servant. That's not very pleasant to talk about. But in the strict sense of what an economic decision is, about allocating resources for a choice, that would be the best choice for me. But I want to take Vik's thought experiment, as I always do, and take a step back. Because that's a situation I don't think we'll ever see, probably, or be in. If I were in my yacht, and I have a huge yacht. Teaching English does well here. If I'm in my yacht and I see a person drowning and a pirate making that offer, that's a whole different situation. As a Christian, I have to decide what I'm going to do. And this is not the scenario you presented, Vik. But I would say it's my duty as a Christian to help that drowning person, not to go back to land and form a maritime governmental state agency and start collecting taxes from people to help that person. And that's the difference. And with that, I'll ask Cheryl where she wants to go.
All right, a couple of things. As you might have figured out by now, this could become an extremely academic conversation.
I take issue with that.
My training as a journalist and a person in public relations aims for clarity and transparency, and so I'm going to try to drag them back toward clarity and transparency by asking some very practical questions from which they can apply that. But before I do that, and at the risk of my colleague and friend, the political science professor, being here on the front row, I'm going to attempt to explain in about 30 seconds some terminology that it took me a semester to master in a poli-sci class long ago. Because we hear this stuff misused all the time, okay? So I'm going to turn my back to you, because if I don't, I will not keep the left and right thing going, and I'll be mixing you up, okay? So if we were to do the political spectrum from left to right, I would be right here in the middle, the flaming moderate. Remember me? Okay. Over here on the far left, we would have radicals. Right here, left of the sensible moderate center, we would have liberals. Then me, sensible moderate center. Then we would have conservatives. And finally, reactionaries, okay? Now, those words on either end are misused and tossed around by people all the time. And those words conservative and liberal are used as labels and insults instead of as a term that explains an approach to power and to human rights versus economic rights versus moral values versus political values. They actually have meaning. If you want more on that, see Dr. Haley after class. But as our terminology moves through this conversation, remember those distinctions, because they're important. And the reason that these two can have civil conversation is because they get that. They understand that, okay? And most of the people who are out there yelling at each other on TV or in political rallies or from positions of power, they do not get that. So that's important. Now, back to the practical questions. Since we first met back in August and talked about plans for today, Houston and Southeast Texas have been devastated by floods that followed Hurricane Harvey. And much of Florida and Puerto Rico have been racked by Irma. FEMA is there. Congress has approved billions of dollars in aid, but nowhere close yet to the amounts that experts say will be required to restore and rebuild. I would be interested in hearing from both of you regarding what the federal government should and should not be doing.
You want to go first? I would like you to. Okay. One of the things I would say from the perspective that I bring to this conversation is that I think a lot of time when we talk about the role of the state in our life together, we have this knee-jerk tendency to focus on rights. And I think our conversation, we focus on rights a lot, right? So liberals and libertarians are concerned about individual rights. I think one of the things that I've been trying to press in conversations that I have with students and colleagues is that when we talk about communities, just societies, it's not enough to simply focus on individual rights. I think it's also important for us to talk about responsibilities, right? The things that we share in common by virtue of the fact that we are all members of a community together. If you think about, the analogy can be overdrawn, but all of you have families that you didn't choose, or at least most of us didn't choose our families. We were born into families, and yet we believe we have obligations to those members of this involuntary association that we're part of. And I think if we see political communities like the country that we're part of as involuntary associations in that sense, I think we can say we have responsibilities to other citizens of our community when they are in need. And so that's why for me, I have no problem saying, as somebody who is a self-identified political liberal, that it's a good thing that we have a system that provides resources and access to emergency intervention whenever that's necessary in our community. We could do that through private charity as well. And yet I think that there would be many people much more vulnerable if we left everything simply to the charity of strangers.
Cole?
That was pretty straight. I have a kind of a bad news, good news answer. The bad news is I think it should be left to charity with the following exception. I think the state has the obligation to care for children and at taxpayer expense. And so I would see that they're beyond the, we could have a talk later about emergency response at the local level, but beyond that, as far as FEMA, a federal disaster situation, I think having taxpayer funded care for children is something libertarians could get on board with.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Just a minute. And so, however, I think the rest of it should be left to charity. Semicolon. What I am so encouraged by, I remember back in every hurricane disaster I've seen as an adult, I have been so encouraged by the response I've seen. People who told their employers, I'm leaving. Not may I leave, but I'm leaving. I'm going to go care for the people who have been ransacked. I've seen amazing responses. So in my consequentialist hat, I think I am encouraged by what I see and believe people would be taken care of. I don't think a person who is unaffected by a hurricane, and that's where I think you would disagree that everyone's affected, but I don't think a person in Montana should be forced to pay for a person's house in Houston who was destroyed by a hurricane. I think this laughter needs
I'm trying to figure out how you would organize like a disaster relief system that would only provide state-sponsored disaster relief for children. Like how do you decide how do you set up a system that says, well, we're only going to pay for the care for the children who are the vulnerable victims?
I would leave it to the local governments, cities, states, counties, and so forth.
Okay.
Okay, even though y'all don't know my next question, this is a great segue. So, Cole, what are the government functions, other than the care of children, for which you think taxation is appropriate?
Okay, now at this point, I want to make sure that I am not speaking for every single libertarian in the world, because libertarians disagree a little bit on this question. I want to make sure that, you know, there's no one from the Libertarian Convention here. There is such a thing, by the way, Libertarian Party. Well, libertarians and I agree almost to a one that the primary goal for government is to be as small as possible, and to enforce property rights, to enforce private contracts, and to enforce liberty of individuals to the degree that it does not, that a person's liberty does not infringe on the liberty of another person. And another way to say that is, you can be free as you want as long as you don't harm another person, with harm construed narrowly. That is a key component, Vic. That harm must be construed narrowly. So a very limited role, and we could get into the military question, which I bet is coming up. So there is, I think, a role for a limited military defense system, which is a pretty big question that I'll just stop there and say there is a role for it.
Okay, but what government functions do you believe taxation is appropriate to fund?
An enforcement of contracts and private property, and so some kind of a police action, and the more local the better, and a limited military function.
Okay.
And
Not even delivering the mail?
no, absolutely not.
Okay.
Mail could be, in fact, lots of mail is privatized.
Okay.
UPS leaves it right on my doorstep.
Okay.
I think it's fantastic.
So, Vic, are there any government functions for which you believe taxation is not appropriate?
That's a good question.
What
I
they
certainly, you know, I try to be pragmatic about what the state can do. And I think one of the dangers that liberals like me can fall into is a sort of utopianism, where we presume that the state intervening and everything is going to make things better. And I think that that is absolutely not the case. There are plenty of bad interventions that states can perpetuate that I think liberals have reason to reject. I would say healthcare is a good example of that. I think I'm for a universal system of healthcare, but I don't think there's any community that can guarantee everybody access to everything. That's a utopia. As long as we're dealing with the problem of scarcity, we have to wrestle with the fact that when you've got a lot of people who need organ transplants and there are not enough organs for everybody to get one, you need some sort of distributive mechanism. So I think maybe to get at your question, I think that there are situations where well-intended liberal advocates have pushed for programs that don't bring wisdom that I think we can bring here from more market-minded folks like our libertarian allies. I'm for having a place for the market in healthcare, for example. I think there needs to be some level of cost sharing if you're going to keep prices down. If you simply give people everything, the cost can quickly escalate because demand simply will increase. And so I think we have to be very pragmatic about those things. I would say, maybe in reply to Cole, is part of what Cole's saying about harm and wanting to protect children from harm and thinking that is a legitimate role that the state should play. The caveat that he conceives harm narrowly is part of a conversation that we've had, because part of our conversation is revolved around things like public education. My argument is that it is a good thing that we have a state-funded system of public education. But I don't think anyone should deceive themselves. A state-funded system of education is redistributive. It's a system which is forcing some people to pay for the education of other people's children. I think that that's a good thing. I am a volunteer at a local public school, and I know that absent a system that ensures they have access to school, there would be some kids whose parents would have great difficulty providing them access to an education. They would have to trust, once again, in the charity of strangers. And That's something that I don't think it's realistic to think that that is the kind of society that's going to ensure opportunity, which to me is essential to liberty.
Yes.
Let me respond to in two ways. The first, at my own peril, I'm going to refer you to a memory from when Ron Paul was a presidential candidate. Ron Paul's kind of a crazy guy. I really like him because his affect is so kind of bizarre. I would love to meet Ron Paul. I haven't done it. But one thing he said that shocked a lot of libertarians when he was on the stage and he was asked about defense spending, because that's a place that a lot of libertarians are just the more the better, or a lot of conservatives are. He said there's a difference between military spending and defense spending. Defense spending is appropriate. Military spending is out of control. And what we should do as a nation is seriously rein back our military spending. And just think, if we did that, how much health care we could offer people. And everyone on stage sat up and the audience said, is he talking about redistributive wealth for health care? And that was not his point. The point is, and he said this later, you can't turn things off like a switch. A country, if you want a country to move, it's like turning a great ship. So a lot of times the answers we give are utopian in an ideal, but we would never think it would work that way in practice. And that was a great moment in a presidential debate. As regards education, I want to refer a book to you if you're interested in this subject, called The Beautiful Tree. You know this book? And in this, I'm not going to tell you about the whole book, but just to say that a man traveled the world and went to some of the poorest countries in the world and found that parents were having their children educated privately alongside state-funded schools, because the private education they were getting at nominal costs to the poorest children was much better. And in my opinion, what state-funded redistributive wealth, thank you. What that gets you is access to a building, and I don't think that gets you education unless your parents are invested. So I'm not convinced that we are protecting children from harm by giving them access to a building. I think a lot more things have to be in play, like parents who care. I saw you look at your watch, so I'm going to stop.
Just trying to keep track,
Okay,
because
right.
We have all these other things to do. Okay, once again, you've kind of given me a nice little segue here. I do think it's only fair to reemphasize that Cole is not a true conservative in the classic sense, but rather a libertarian, which is confusing to lots of people. Especially because in this most recent election, so many people who thought of themselves as conservatives but didn't want to vote for Donald Trump decided that they would suddenly become libertarians who didn't have a clue what it meant to be a libertarian. And that prompted all kinds of hateful conversation back and forth, even on one side or the other of that reasonable moderate. On that classic continuum, though, the farther right one moves, the more comfortable one becomes with centralized power. And so fascism is the 20th century epitome of a reactionary philosophy. And yet, centralized power is the thing that we hear so often conservatives have the greatest objection to, okay? So do you see why that terminology is important? All that said, given the status quo of 2017, Cole, I think you find yourself on the conservative end of things on a lot of issues. And yet, you did say you're sort of a classic liberal, one who advocates for a high level of individual freedom in decision-making. So Vik, you thought I was going to ask him a question. In what circumstances of the status quo do you find yourself landing uncomfortably to the right?
That's a really good question. I would say I'll point to two topics. One of them is abortion. I believe that there are exceptional cases where women should have the right to choose abortion. I defend the right of women to choose abortion in cases of rape, incest, and when the life or health of the mother is at risk. But I would support regulations that protect embryonic human life beyond the point of viability, acknowledging that that is a point about which there's some debate. Where is that? But I think especially as you move into the late second and third trimester, there is a strong moral case to be made that the moral value of embryonic human life is something that needs to be accounted for in public policy. So that would be one that I would point to. There was a second one. Here's the other one. This might get me into a bit of hot water with some. Maybe
Never
not in
happened
this
before.
audience. I know that many of my liberal colleagues are of the mind that private businesses should be subject to anti-discrimination laws whenever they, for example, deny service to gay and lesbian persons. And I've got strong religious liberty concerns about that as well. Even though I would not encourage a private business to deny service, I think that if we're going to value freedom of conscience, I think that that's something that we need to account for, and we need to recognize the rights of private business owners to practice their, to uphold their religious beliefs within the context of the businesses that they run. I understand that that starts tipping back into the 1960s, where you had people that were making similar arguments on the basis of race, and I'm unsettled by that, but I feel the force of the argument.
I would really like to add something to that. Vik is hitting on something I think is crucial to this conversation, which is why Vik and I get along so well. We know each other's motives, and we have a higher calling than the state. Okay, I think I was born in 1966, so I was a little bit past a lot as an adult, the civil rights era. But I think what a difference it would have made if we would have had Christians making more noise, not in the public square, but in the private business squares, saying, you know what, everyone is available to come to my lunch counter and have coffee and breakfast at my lunch counter. Blacks, whites, it doesn't matter. Everyone is welcome at my bakery, my lunch counter, my water fountains are all the same, my restrooms are all the same. What a difference the church could have made, given that liberty, if without the interference of no discrimination, the church could have stood up and should have. We should have beat the state to the punch. I would have loved to have seen that happen, and I think it was a missed opportunity. The way I understand it, I was a child at the time.
I am so tempted to just take off into First Amendment issues here because, that's kind of where I live. We're going to come back to one of those, but I'm going to stay with the plan. A lot of economists understand that taxation is a device for encouraging or discouraging various behaviors, at least as often as it is a device to generate revenue. And so we tax cigarettes and alcohol and gasoline in order to reduce consumption. We give tax rate or credit benefits for things like charitable gifts and mortgage interest and having children. I'd just like to hear your comments. We'll start with you.
Yes, we do that. No, if you're asking about things like sin taxes, for example, I see those as, for me, like if you're talking about taxing cigarettes, for example, I think that there are public health justifications for policies like that. If you've got people engaging in activities that are increasing healthcare costs across the board for an entire community, I think there's strong reason to say that there needs to be some cost sharing in the form of taxes. Now, if that limits the amount of consumption of tobacco, I think that's all the better. But the sad fact is that a lot of times those taxes aren't necessarily going to fund programs that are fighting and improving public health, but I have no problem with them.
Cole?
I think there's a wealth of data that shows that people follow incentives, and I think tax breaks and taxes incentivize.
And do you approve or disapprove of that?
I think it is not up for approval or disapproval, it's a fact.
Yeah, but if you were writing the tax code,
If I were writing the tax code, every single earner would have skin in the game. I think it's one of the biggest problems we have now. What Mitt Romney said that lost him the election was ugly and mean, but it was not false. The year he said it, 47% of people who filed tax returns paid no federal income tax. That was a fact. And I think that is, when people can vote for things that they are not paying for, I don't know why we would expect them to stop. So I think a tax revision where everyone who earns or everyone is involved pays taxes is a necessary corrective.
I can tell you're just itching to get into this, Vic, so go ahead.
Well, I support a progressive tax system, and I think the idea of like a flat tax, for example, where you've got somebody living a full-time minimum wage job who is suddenly having to pay, 15% of their income, that burden falls disproportionately on them. That 15% is felt much more profoundly by somebody earning $20,000 a year than it is somebody earning $200,000. And so, again, back to the point I'm making about liberty and the value of liberty, protecting the equal worth of liberty is important. And that's why a progressive tax system, in my view, does that better, because I think that paying 15% of your income to ensure that everybody has skin in the game hinders opportunity. There are many fewer opportunities available to you when that money you could have used to maybe help pay for higher education or these other things that could improve your prospects. Those are limited whenever we place these kinds of burdens on people. So I disagree.
Okay. Generally, those to the left of the spectrum place more emphasis on human rights, and those on the right to property rights. And in fact, a lot of conservatives might even argue that property rights are one of the human rights. Okay. So just for fun, because this has been so much fun, as we conclude today, I'd like to just throw out a few topics dominating the public square these days. And we'll alternate on who goes first. And then the first to respond, summarize your view, and the second person should summarize why he disagrees, assuming that he does disagree. Okay? And I'm going to start, though, with a topic that you've already introduced, and let Cole respond to that, because I didn't do that a while ago. And that is the subject of abortion. Because, so, okay, in the interest of full disclosure, Cole and I have discussed this just a little bit in the past. I think that it's most common for libertarians to believe that abortion is an area where the law should not intervene, although you have explained to me in the past that many libertarians object to abortion. But Vic got to talk about that a while ago and you didn't, so your turn.
I tend to believe that the life of the fetus is a life that should be protected with almost no exception. I certainly don't think that taxpayer money should pay for it.
And how do you feel about tax money supporting laws that prohibit it?
Well, in the way that taxes produce police that protect other things, then it is in line with policemen protecting other rights.
Okay.
Was that an insufficient answer?
Cole and I.
It
How
can be
about I
a giant
moderate?
discussion, but I'm trying to be minimal for the sake of time.
I understand. I just think that women ought to get to pass those laws, and that Christian women ought to advocate on one side, and women who are not should advocate on another, and men should sit quietly. But I often get outvoted on that. So, although women vote more than men, you do know that. Okay, just thought I'd throw that out. Okay, so back to the topics, and let's see. So I'll start with Vic.
Okay.
You can comment, and you can tell us why you might disagree. First topic, First Amendment and hate speech.
I think people should have the right to speak what they believe, and I think that is your question about whether or not there should be laws that prohibit hate speech?
My question is, as a liberal, what is your view?
I tend to default toward protection of the freedom of people to speak what they believe, even if they believe something that I deem morally aberrant. And I think academic communities need to be places where those ideas are heard, and if they're aberrant, they need to be critiqued. I think that absent that, I think you allow that kind of speech to flourish in areas where it gains a following. To me, free speech is a way of protecting freedom.
I could not agree more.
This makes me so happy. Okay, Cole, what about First Amendment and pornography?
People in this country have the right to view pornography as long as it does not involve children, and children would have to be an age that is debated, I'm aware. But I think it's the Christian's role to persuade against, but I think it's the state's role to allow pornography.
I agree.
See, they do agree about some things, and they're so polite and nice when they do. Estate taxes. Vic, your turn. As a liberal,
Yeah.
what is your view of estate taxes?
I'm a strong supporter of estate taxes. I believe that one of the arguments that people make in support of property rights is that whenever I have worked hard to create something, I have a right to the fruits of my labor. And I think that resources that are passed on from one person to another that I receive were not the byproduct of my personal labor. And I think I would also say that the community that we're part of creates conditions for people to be successful and entrepreneurial, and that there's a larger social price to be paid to maintain a system that creates that kind of market for people to work. And so that's why I have no problem if there's a billionaire who's trying to pass on resources to their children, if they have to pay a portion of that to the state. I support that.
Cole, I saw you twitch.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that argument. I think people who behave well with money build wealth, and they should be allowed to pass it down as a gift to whomever they please, including their own children. And I think you hear stories of people who have inherited large tracts of land and have to sell and sell and sell in order to pay the taxes until one day they don't own very much anymore. And I think it's designed to do that. It's about returning things back to the middle. So that hits your second argument, which is we've created the conditions by which you can flourish. And I really disagree with that argument. Here's why. My dad was a baker. We had a bakery. There were people who came in and built the bakery. They entered into private contracts to build the bakery. They were paid. There were people who cleaned. They entered into a private wage agreement. They were paid. People who meet needs in the marketplace and do well have agreements with people via private contract and wages for services and goods, and when they meet the goods and services need in the marketplace, they gain wealth. And I don't think that it goes beyond that when you're talking about what the community has done. When Obama said you didn't build that, he lost a lot of people who were not in my camp, but were near my camp or in the middle, because I think that argument does not hold water.
Part of the argument in support of estate taxes is when you think about free markets that operate without any sort of intervention, what happens over time is wealth starts to accrue among people who have been more successful in the market. They might have taken more risks and been successful. They might have been entrepreneurial. They might have made better judgments about what they should do than other people. But over time, wealth accrues, and by virtue of that, power accrues as well. And so part of the defense of estate taxes is also to ensure that you've got markets that create opportunity. You need to fight against markets allowing power to accrue in certain regions or in among a few people. And so that would be the other argument that I would make, that in a way it's a way of enhancing liberty by ensuring that there is a more level playing field whenever we've got people working in the market.
And so does that mean you don't have any moral qualms about the fact that an estate tax is the second time at least that the same funds have been taxed?
I think estate taxes can be done poorly, and I think if what Cole is saying is true, and you've got a system in which estate taxes are such that people are having to do what he is describing, I would see that as a problem. I can't speak to the specifics of that, but my defense is that you don't have to organize a system in which estate taxes create those kinds of situations. You could reduce the estate tax. You could do something that doesn't create the kinds of situations that Cole is describing.
Who went first last?
I think I did.
Okay. Legalization of marijuana.
Today, as Christians, we should discourage it. It should be legal, however. I mean, we should perhaps discourage, if we are called to do so, recreational use. I know physicians who have said, we've used herbs for eons. Why can't we use this herb when it has so many medicinal purposes? But even for recreation, yes, if we feel like we shouldn't do it or others shouldn't do it, we should persuade, but not make it illegal.
I agree.
Okay. The death penalty.
I am opposed to the death penalty.
I am opposed to the death penalty.
On what grounds?
Cost. I also have moral reservations about taking life whenever you've got a person that no longer poses a threat to the community. So those are at least two reasons that I have for being opposed to the death penalty.
Cool.
Same. It's fine to value life and say certain criminals should be removed from the populace. Doesn't mean you have to take their life.